In 1893, a Creole woman made a dress for her master's bride, and she sewed her revenge into it. Under the heavy heat of a Louisiana summer in 1893, the scent of magnolia hung thick in the air, sweet enough to mask the quiet bitterness that lived beneath it. Inside the grand house on St. Martin Plantation, lace curtains fluttered lazily in the wind, while the distant hum of cicadas bled into the sound of a needle passing through silk. A young Creole woman sat by the window, her dark fingers moving with measured grace as she sewed a gown the color of moonlight. Each stitch gleamed in the dim light, delicate, perfect, and deliberate. Her name was Marielle. To those who owned her, she was just a gifted seamstress, the best in the parish, they liked to boast. To those who whispered her name in the slave quarters, she was something else entirely, a woman wronged, a woman who had learned that silence could be sharper than any blade. The dress she worked on wasn't just any dress. It was a wedding gown, a gift for the bride of her master, Henri Devereaux, the same man who had once promised her freedom and gave her chains instead. The same man whose voice she could still hear in her nightmares, smooth as honey, cruel as winter. As the needle slid through silk, Marielle's lips moved soundlessly. Some said she spoke to herself when she worked, murmuring old Creole prayers. Others said it wasn't prayer at all, that she whispered names, names of those who had crossed her, names of those who never woke to see another sunrise. Outside, the plantation prepared for celebration. Musicians tuned their violins, servants polished silver until it gleamed like sunlight on water. But inside that small sewing room, time seemed to stop. The walls breathed with secrets, and if you looked closely enough, you might notice that Marielle wasn't just sewing fabric. She was binding something far heavier, rage, sorrow, and a promise no one would see until it was too late. They said her eyes looked strange that night, glassy, distant, almost knowing. "She's been working too long," one of the maids muttered. But Marielle didn't hear her. She was listening to the dress, to the rhythm of the thread, to the quiet heartbeat of her revenge. Every loop of silk carried meaning. A hidden mark here, a subtle knot there, patterns only she understood, old Creole symbols almost invisible to the untrained eye, symbols that spoke of justice and of spirits that did not rest until balance was restored. By the time dawn broke, the gown was finished. It shimmered faintly in the morning light, pure and innocent, a perfect masterpiece. And yet, as Marielle lifted it in her arms, her expression didn't mirror pride. It was calm, hollow, almost peaceful. She folded the dress gently, pressed it to her chest, and whispered something only the fabric could hear. When she carried it to her master's house, the air felt different, thicker, charged. Henri Devereaux smiled when he saw her. "Beautiful," he said, running his hand across the silk. "You've outdone yourself, Marielle." She bowed her head, hiding the glint in her eyes. "It's the finest I've ever made," she replied softly. "And it was made for her, with every piece of my heart." If only he knew how true that was. The wedding was set for the following evening, and the entire parish would attend. They would toast, dance, and whisper about the elegance of the bride, the golden-haired woman who would wear Marielle's creation. But none of them would know the truth sewn beneath the lace. None of them would see the threads that carried centuries of pain and defiance. And as the day approached, something strange began to spread across the plantation. Servants spoke of chills that came without wind. Candles flickered when Marielle passed by. The bride-to-be complained of sudden dreams, dreams of drowning in white fabric, of voices calling her name from beneath the floorboards. Still, no one questioned it. Not yet. Marielle watched it all unfold with quiet patience. Her revenge wasn't loud, nor was it swift. It was silent, precise, and inevitable, like the pull of a needle through silk. And if you stay until the end of this story, You'll discover the secret she stitched into that gown, a secret that not even death could silence. Because this isn't just a tale about a dress. It's about the curse woven into its seams, and the woman who dared to make her suffering immortal. Louisiana, 1893. A land caught between worlds. The war had ended decades ago, yet its ghosts still haunted the soil. The plantations stood like fading monuments of a cruel past, their fields quieter now, but not empty. Behind the perfume of jasmine and the sound of laughter at evening gatherings, an old hierarchy still breathed, dressed in civility and wealth, and beneath it all the whispers of the forgotten carried on through the cracks in the wooden floors and the rustle of sugarcane in the wind. The Devereaux plantation was one of the last great estates of its kind, built on the blood and labor of those who had no choice. Henri Devereaux, the master of the house, had inherited not just the land, but the arrogance of generations who believed themselves untouchable. He was admired in town, refined, charming, generous at church. But those who worked under his roof knew another side, a man who could smile while breaking a soul. Marielle had grown up within those same walls. Her mother had been a cook in the Devereaux kitchen, her grandmother a midwife who whispered prayers in a dialect half forgotten. Though the law no longer called her a slave, freedom was a word that still came with conditions. She could not leave without permission, could not earn without approval, could not love without consequence. To the outside world, she was one of the lucky ones. Inside, she was a ghost kept alive by the thread of her own endurance. The world outside the plantation was changing, but not quickly enough. In New Orleans, Creole culture thrived, music, color, rebellion in rhythm. But in the rural parishes, the old rules held tight. The church spoke of redemption, but the people still believed in blood. The bayous carried legends of spirits that punished the wicked and protected the betrayed. And the locals whispered that some women could weave those spirits into fabric, that certain hands, when moved by vengeance or love, could make cloth remember. At night, the Devereaux manor seemed to hum with the weight of its past. The chandeliers swayed softly, even when no wind touched them. In the corridors, portraits of stern ancestors watched with cold, painted eyes. The servants avoided the eastern wing after dark. They said that was where the cries were heard, soft and distant, like someone sewing in their sleep. It was in that same wing where Marielle worked. The small sewing room, tucked behind a heavy oak door, was her sanctuary and her prison. The windows looked out toward the marsh, where the moonlight turned the water silver and the cypress trees cast shadows that resembled hands reaching out of the earth. The smell of damp wood mixed with the sweetness of silk, creating a strange, almost sacred atmosphere. Part chapel, part tomb. Every object in that room told a story. The iron scissors passed down from her grandmother, said to cut more than fabric. The old thimble, engraved with a serpent, a symbol from the old country, and a locked wooden box in the corner, one she never opened in front of anyone. It was said to contain things not meant to be seen, locks of hair, bits of thread, fragments of lace from dresses made for the dead. To outsiders, the plantation was a place of beauty. White columns, trimmed gardens, the laughter of guests who never looked too closely. But to those who lived within its shadow, beauty was only a disguise. The soil beneath the rose bushes was heavy, some said too heavy, as if it carried more than roots. Rumors drifted through the quarters about Marielle, that she had once loved the master, that she had borne him a child who vanished mysteriously, that she had made a vow by candlelight never to forgive. None dared ask her. But when she looked at Henri's bride, a young woman from Savannah with soft hands and an untested heart, there was something in Marielle's gaze that no one could name. Not hatred, not envy, something colder, something ancient. The wedding preparations only deepened the strange unease that had settled over the house. The bride's gown hung in Marielle's room, veiled and untouched. Yet some swore they saw it move, just slightly, when no one was near. One of the maids claimed she heard faint humming from inside the closet, the same melody Marielle sang while sewing. Another said the candles went out on their own the moment Marielle whispered over the fabric, but no one spoke of it openly. In 1893, superstition and fear were common companions in Louisiana. The line between the living and the dead was thin, and everyone knew that wronging the wrong person could invite something far worse than shame. So the household continued its charade of normalcy, music, laughter, wedding rehearsals, yet every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every silence heavier. And in that oppressive stillness, the truth waited, buried in the seams of silk, bound by the hands of a woman the world had tried to forget. Because in that house, history wasn't something written in books. It was sewn into the walls, whispered through the generations, and on that summer night in 1893, it was waiting, patient, invisible, and hungry. Marielle was not the kind of woman people noticed at first glance. She spoke softly, moved quietly, and carried herself with the restraint of someone who had learned that visibility was dangerous. Her skin was the color of burnt sugar, her hair always tied beneath a faded kerchief, and her eyes, those deep, steady eyes, seemed to hold centuries inside them. She had been born on the plantation in a world that told her she was both necessary and invisible, but even as a child, she understood something most didn't. Silence could be a weapon too. Her gift for sewing was discovered early. At 9, she repaired her mother's torn apron so finely that it looked new. By 15, she was crafting gowns for the mistress of the house. And by 20, her reputation had spread beyond the plantation. White women from nearby towns would send for her designs, never knowing the face behind the fabric. Henri Devereux knew, though. He noticed everything about her. Henri was a man carved from charm and cruelty in equal measure. To the guests who drank his wine, he was a gentleman, witty, educated, generous. But to those who served him, he was a shadow with a smile. When he looked at Marielle, it wasn't as an artisan or a woman of talent. It was as something he owned, something he could summon with a single word. And when he broke her heart, he didn't even look back to see the ruin left behind. Years before his engagement, there had been whispers of an affair, of stolen moments in the attic, of late-night visits under the pretense of new orders for the dress. The servants knew, of course. They always did. But on the plantation, truth had a way of rotting quietly. Then one night, Marielle disappeared for 3 days. When she returned, she was thinner, quieter, and something in her eyes had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by a calm that unsettled even the cruelest overseer. No one knew where she had been, and she never spoke of it. The only thing that changed was her work. Her stitching became more intricate, her patterns more symbolic. Some of her embroidery began to include strange marks, circles, crosses, knots within knots. The older women in the quarters recognized them. "Bondi's work," they murmured. "God's work," or something close to it. Then came Elise Beaumont, Henri's bride-to-be. She was 20, educated in finishing schools, her laughter like the sound of porcelain breaking. She had never known hunger, never known fear. When she arrived at the plantation, she marveled at its beauty. The high ceilings, the fields stretching like oceans. She spoke kindly to the servants, but with the distance of someone raised to believe kindness was a gift she could bestow, not something owed. When Elise first met Marielle, she was instantly captivated. "You're the one making my gown?" she asked, smiling as if the world itself were hers. Marielle curtsied slightly. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Every stitch will tell your story." Elise laughed, not understanding the weight of those words. "Then make it a beautiful one," she said. Marielle's answer was soft, almost inaudible. "It will be unforgettable." Over the following weeks, Elise visited the sewing room often, asking about fabrics, lace and colors. She would chatter endlessly, unaware that Marielle's silence was not shyness but focus, a deliberate stillness born from something far deeper. Sometimes when Elise left, Marielle would touch the silk she had handled and whisper under her breath, as if cleansing it from unseen stains. To the other servants, Marielle's calm was unsettling. "She's planning something," one of them whispered. "I can feel it in my bones." But no one dared question her directly. There was something sacred in her presence, something untouchable. Even the cruel overseer avoided her gaze. At night, when the plantation slept, Marielle would light a single candle and sit before the gown. She would trace its folds with trembling fingers, her lips moving in rhythm with the needle. In those moments, she wasn't sewing a dress for a wedding. She was sewing a requiem. Each thread carried her memories, her mother's songs, her child's lost cry, her own silent screams swallowed by the walls. Sometimes she would imagine Henri's face, the smile, the condescension, the lies. She would picture Elise standing beside him in the church, radiant and blind to the darkness behind her, and she would feel a stillness settle in her chest, not hate, not rage, something colder, something resolute. Because for Marielle, this wasn't just revenge. It was balance, it was justice woven into beauty. And when the gown was finally complete, no one would see the curse she had hidden within it, the curse stitched not out of hatred, but out of remembrance. In a world that had stolen her voice, this dress would speak for her, and its whisper would be heard long after she was gone. The first sign that something was wrong came on a night thick with heat and silence. The sewing room had been closed for hours, but a faint sound echoed through the corridor, the rhythmic whisper of thread sliding through fabric. One of the housemaids, Clara, froze when she heard it. Everyone knew Marielle had finished the gown days ago, yet the sound continued, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat under the floor. She crept toward the door, her candle trembling in the dark. The light caught the edge of the wedding gown hanging near the window, its pale silk shimmering faintly. The air inside smelled strange, not of roses or starch, but something earthy, faintly metallic, like rain on old iron. Clara called softly, "Marielle?" No answer. Only the faint rustle of fabric, though no one seemed to be touching it. The next morning, the gown was moved to the main house. Henri wanted to show it to his guests, a symbol of new beginnings, he said with a laugh that made the servants exchange glances. Marielle stood beside him, silent, as the women admired the dress. The bride gasped when she saw it. "It's perfect," Elise said, running her fingers along the lace sleeves. "It feels alive." The phrase made Marielle's lips curve into a small, unreadable smile. "Every piece of it was made by hand," she said softly. "It carries many things." Later that day, while adjusting the gown on its mannequin, Elise noticed something strange. Along the inner hem, invisible unless one looked closely, a pattern had been stitched in faint gold thread. Tiny symbols repeating like a code. Circles within circles, small crosses, and an unfamiliar sigil resembling a serpent eating its own tail. "What are these?" she asked. Marielle looked up from her sewing basket. Her expression didn't change. "Just blessings, Miss Elise, to protect you on your wedding day." Elise smiled, reassured, and let her continue. But that night, when she went to bed, the pattern lingered in her mind. Protection, she thought. Then why did it look so much like binding? 2 nights before the wedding, a storm rolled in from the bayou. Thunder rattled the windows, and the candles in the great hall flickered violently. One of the servants, a boy who slept near the sewing room, swore he heard laughter through the storm. Not cruel, not loud, but soft, lilting, like a lullaby sung to someone long dead. The next morning, strange things began to happen. The white roses ordered for the ceremony arrived wilted. A framed portrait fell from the wall with no wind to move it. The air inside the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. When Elise entered the dressing room, she froze. Her gown, which she had left neatly folded the night before, was spread out across the floor, its train fanned like wings. No one admitted to touching it. She summoned Marielle immediately. "Did you come in here last night?" Elise demanded. Marielle's eyes flickered toward the gown, then back to her. "No, ma'am," she said quietly, "but perhaps it wanted to breathe." Elise felt a chill slide down her spine. "It?" she whispered. Marielle didn't answer. That evening, as the storm returned, Henri entered the sewing room. He wanted to speak to Marielle privately about her attitude, as he called it. But when he found her, she was sitting by the window, staring at the marshlands, her hands resting motionless on her lap. "You've been avoiding me," he said. She didn't turn. "You'll have no place here after tomorrow, you know that." Marielle finally looked at him then. "I know," she said softly. "After tomorrow, no one will." Henri frowned, unsure whether to laugh or feel uneasy. "Is that a threat?" Marielle's gaze didn't waver. "It's a promise," she whispered. He left, slamming the door, and didn't notice the faint movement of the gown behind him, as if the silk itself had exhaled. That night, Clara, the maid, returned to the sewing room to fetch her lost kerchief. The room was empty, the window open. But when she lifted the kerchief from the floor, she froze. There, just beneath the fabric, lay a single golden thread, so fine it almost vanished when touched. Yet when she picked it up, it burned her fingertips, leaving a faint mark shaped like a circle and a cross. She never told anyone what she found, but from that night on, Clara crossed herself every time she passed Marielle in the hall, and the wedding gown was never left alone again. Because somehow everyone in that house began to feel it, that the dress was not just a creation, it was waiting. The closer the wedding drew, the more uneasy the plantation became. Servants whispered that the house felt different, heavier somehow, as if every door concealed a secret. The laughter that once filled the halls grew strained, forced, and in the midst of it all, Marielle worked quietly, her presence like a shadow that never quite left the corner of one's vision. Henri Devereux walked through his home like a man who believed he owned both heaven and hell. He gave orders with the ease of breathing, spoke down to those who built his fortune, and treated kindness as a transaction. To him, Marielle was still his creation, the woman who had once warmed his nights, and now warmed his reputation. It was he who decided that she would sew his bride's gown. He thought it was poetic, a token of forgiveness, he had called it, but forgiveness was not something Marielle believed in anymore. Behind his charm, Henri hid a rot that everyone smelled but no one dared name. His wealth had been rebuilt after the war through deceit and cruelty, buying land from ruined families, forcing debt upon freed workers, punishing anyone who questioned his power. He smiled in church on Sundays, a silver cross gleaming against his suit. But in the evenings, his sins gathered like smoke around him, and Marielle had carried those memories, the bruises, the promises, the silence, into every stitch of that gown. The injustice ran deeper than their story. The law may have freed her people, but it had not freed their lives. Wages were withheld, contracts forged, threats whispered into ears at night. Freedom had become another form of captivity, and Henri was the embodiment of that lie, a man who believed that possession could wear the mask of love. On the eve of the wedding, Elise approached Marielle again. "You never told me," she said gently, "how long you've worked for my husband." Marielle's fingers paused mid-stitch. "Too long," she replied. Elise smiled, misunderstanding. "He speaks highly of you." Marielle looked up slowly. Then he must have forgotten the truth. Elise tilted her head. The truth? She asked. But Marielle said nothing more. That afternoon the house was filled with music. The bride's family had arrived, the priest rehearsed the ceremony, and Henri boasted of the grand union that would restore dignity to the Devereux name. Yet, in the midst of celebration, a quiet rebellion pulsed beneath the surface. The servants exchanged glances, uneasy but curious. Some swore they had seen Marielle in the chapel alone, standing before the altar, whispering under her breath. Others claimed that when she passed, candles flickered, though no wind followed her. When the overseer confronted her about the missing spool of gold thread, she only smiled. "It's not missing," she said. "It's serving its purpose." That night, the injustice of years weighed on her like chains. She remembered her mother's body buried without ceremony, her child's cry swallowed by the swamp, and Henri's laughter echoing as if none of it mattered. The world had watched and done nothing. Priests, judges, and neighbors alike. They had all dressed cruelty in civility and called it order, so Marielle decided the order would end. In her small room, she opened the wooden box in the corner, the one no one was allowed to touch. Inside lay relics of grief, locks of hair, ribbons, scraps of burned fabric. She added one final piece, a thread from the hem of the gown. Then she whispered a name, Henri's. The candle beside her flared suddenly, the flame stretching tall and blue before settling back into stillness. The room grew colder, the air dense with the scent of iron. Marielle did not flinch. She knew what it meant. The veil between the living and the dead was listening. When the thunder rolled again, she began to hum. It was an old Creole lullaby, one her mother had sung, a song of lost souls and broken promises. Each note seemed to vibrate through the floor, into the earth, into the roots that fed the plantation itself. And somewhere deep beneath that cursed soil, something stirred. The next morning, Elise awoke to find her veil lying beside her pillow, though she swore she had locked it away. In the corner of the fabric was a faint stain, not of dirt or dye, but something darker, something that looked like dried blood. When she showed it to Marielle, the seamstress simply said, "The earth remembers what it's owed." Henri laughed when he heard of it. "Superstition," he sneered. But even he couldn't ignore the chill that ran down his spine when he saw Marielle watching him from across the hall, her face unreadable, her eyes bright with the kind of calm that only comes before the storm. Because the storm was coming. And for the first time, Henri Devereux was not the one in control. The morning of the wedding began with sunlight so pale it seemed reluctant to touch the earth. The house was alive with sound, footsteps, laughter, the tuning of instruments, yet beneath the noise there lingered something strange, a hum of unease that none could name. The maids moved quickly, their eyes darting toward corners as if the walls themselves were listening. Even the priest, an old man from New Orleans, fumbled with his Bible as though its words had grown heavier overnight. In the dressing room, the gown waited. Its silk shimmered under the faint light, flawless and innocent, but the air around it felt cold, thick. Elise stood before it, trembling with a joy she didn't fully understand. "It's perfect," she whispered to her reflection. But when she reached out to touch the fabric, a jolt of static pricked her fingertips. She laughed nervously, telling herself it was only the dry air. Marielle entered quietly, carrying the veil folded over her arm. She moved with an eerie calm, her steps measured, her gaze unblinking. "You look beautiful," she said softly. Elise smiled, relieved by her presence. "I couldn't have done this without you." Marielle nodded. "No," she said, her tone unreadable. "You couldn't have." As Marielle fastened the final buttons, Elise caught her reflection in the mirror. For the briefest moment, it seemed there was someone else staring back. Not her own eyes, but darker, older, watching from within the silk. She blinked, and it was gone. Meanwhile, downstairs, Henry was pacing. The priest had lost the wedding ring. One of the guests had fainted inexplicably, claiming she'd felt a hand brush against her neck. The servants whispered of a shadow that moved where no person stood. Henri cursed them all for fools. "This house is full of cowards," he spat, pouring himself a drink. "It's just a wedding." But when he looked at his own reflection in the polished glass cabinet, he swore he saw something move behind him, a woman's silhouette, slender and still. He turned quickly. No one was there. The scent of magnolia hung faintly in the air. Upstairs, Elise felt her chest tighten. "It's hard to breathe," she murmured, clutching the lace at her throat. "The corset's too tight." Marielle didn't answer. Her hands moved gracefully, almost reverently, as she adjusted the gown. But Elise noticed something. The stitching inside the bodice. Threads she hadn't seen before, darker than the rest, almost black, woven into a strange, looping pattern. "What is this?" she asked. Marielle's eyes flicked up to meet hers in the mirror. "It's tradition," she said. "Something old. To bind your love." "Bind?" Elise echoed, her voice trembling slightly. Marielle smiled faintly. "Until death parts you." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, though no clouds yet touched the horizon. The heat thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. One of the maids crossed herself as the clock struck noon. "The veil," Marielle said quietly, holding it up. "You must wear it now." As Elise lifted it, she gasped. The lace was different, finer than before, but along its edge ran faint stains, like smoke pressed into the fabric. "It's burned," she whispered. Marielle's expression softened, almost sad. "Everything that's beautiful," she said, "must first endure fire." When the bride descended the stairs moments later, every conversation in the hall fell silent. The guests stared, not in admiration, but in awe tinged with unease. The gown shimmered like light reflected off water, and yet the air around her seemed to dim. The flowers on the banister drooped as she passed. Somewhere in the rafters, a dove that had been trapped for days fell suddenly dead, its white feathers scattering like snow. Henri, though visibly unnerved, forced a smile. "Perfection," he said, kissing her hand. "You look divine." But when he touched the gown, a chill crept up his arm, and his skin erupted in gooseflesh. "Cold," he muttered. Elise frowned. "It shouldn't be." In the church, as the ceremony began, the unease deepened. The air felt too still. The candles flickered, though there was no draught. When the priest opened his mouth to speak, his voice faltered. "Dearly beloved," he began, but the words stumbled, as if his tongue had turned heavy. He tried again, slower this time. Behind him the crucifix creaked on its chain. As Henri and Elise joined hands, Marielle stood in the back pew, silent, watching. Her face betrayed nothing, but her fingers traced an invisible pattern against her palm. With each repetition, the air seemed to grow colder. Then came the first scream. It was soft. A guest near the aisle clutching her chest, whispering that she saw the veil move on its own. The priest tried to calm her, but before he could, a second scream followed. This time from Henri's mother, her eyes wide with terror as the bride's gown shimmered faintly, as though something were moving beneath it. Elise's breath came quick and shallow. "Marielle," she whispered, searching the crowd, but the seamstress was gone. Outside, the sky finally broke open, thunder roaring like judgment. Rain poured against the church windows, and as lightning flashed, the guests swore they saw the bride's reflection, not her own face but another's, staring back through the veil. The ceremony stopped. The doors slammed shut. And for the first time, even Henri Devereux could not laugh away what he felt. The sensation that the very thing meant to unite him had come alive to destroy him. Panic rippled through the church like fire through dry grass. The storm outside roared, thunder shaking the stained glass as if the heavens themselves demanded entry. Elise clutched Henri's arm, trembling. "What's happening?" she whispered. But Henri had no answer. The priest stammered prayers, the Latin words dissolving into echoes that no one seemed to understand anymore. The candles sputtered out. One by one, shadows stretched across the pews. Then, amid the confusion, a gust of cold air swept through the room, and the bride's veil lifted on its own, hovering for a heartbeat before falling gently to the floor. Beneath it, Elise's face was pale, her pupils wide and black as ink. "Marielle!" Henri shouted, his voice cracking through the silence. "Where is she?" Someone pointed toward the rear of the church. The doors that had slammed shut minutes earlier were now wide open, swaying in the wind. In the doorway stood a figure drenched by the rain, holding something in her hands. A small box. She stepped forward. Lightning flashed, and for a second everyone saw her clearly. Marielle. Her dress was soaked, her hair clinging to her skin, and her eyes carried a calm so deep it was terrifying. "This doesn't belong to you," she said softly, her voice almost drowned by the storm. Henri's jaw clenched. "What trick is this?" he hissed. Marielle's gaze didn't waver. She opened the box slowly, revealing something glimmering inside. A tiny lock of hair tied with a thread of black silk. The same silk that lined Elise's gown. The priest crossed himself. What have you done?" Marielle looked down at the box. "I returned what was taken." Then she whispered something, a single word no one could quite catch. The candles flared back to life, burning twice as bright. The scent of smoke filled the air, but it wasn't from the wicks. It was coming from the dress. Elise gasped as a faint trail of grey rose from the hem of her gown. "Henri!" she cried, her hands clawing at the fabric. But when he reached to help, the silk burned him, leaving a mark across his palm. A dark spiral identical to the pattern stitched inside the bodice. "Take it off!" someone shouted, but the gown wouldn't tear. The seams were fused, the buttons unyielding. The silk clung to Elise's body as if it were alive, pulsing faintly with every beat of her heart. "Marielle, please!" Elise screamed. "Make it stop!" For the first time, something broke in Marielle's composure, a flicker of pain. "I tried to warn you," she said, "but he made me sew with the thread of another's death. It remembers her." "The other woman," Elise gasped. "The one before me." Marielle nodded slowly. "He said she drowned. But he lied. He buried her in that very silk." The room fell silent. Even the storm seemed to hesitate. Henri's voice was hoarse, desperate. "You're mad!" he spat. "All of you!" But then the church bell tolled. Once, twice, though no one had touched the rope. The sound echoed deep, metallic, like a heartbeat under the floor. With each chime, the mark on Henri's hand darkened, spreading up his wrist like ink in water. Elise backed away, shaking. "Henri!" He tried to speak, but his voice cracked into a whisper. The scent of magnolia filled the air, strong, suffocating. He turned toward Marielle, but she was gone. The box lay open on the ground, the lock of hair now turned to ash. Then Elise looked down and saw a single black thread slipping from her gown, moving on its own, snaking across the floor toward Henri's feet. He froze as it wrapped around his shoe, curling like smoke. He tried to step back, but it tightened. In the next flash of lightning, the thread was gone, but so was the mark on his hand. Only a faint whisper remained in the air, carried on the wind through the open doors. "Every stitch remembers." The storm eased. The candles steadied. And yet, As the priest bent to pick up the fallen veil, he found something that chilled him to the bone. A second veil, identical to the first, hidden beneath it, but marked with initials no one recognized. It wasn't Elise's, and it wasn't new. The next morning, the plantation stood silent beneath a haze of rain. The wedding feast had been abandoned, plates still full, candles burned to stubs, chairs overturned as if the night itself had devoured every trace of joy. Only the faint scent of magnolia lingered, mingling with the metallic tang of storm-soaked earth. By noon, whispers began to spread among the servants. Some claimed to have seen Marielle vanish into the cypress woods. Others swore she'd been taken by spirits of the swamp. But one thing was certain. Henri and Elise had locked themselves inside the manor, and the seamstress' S-room, the attic at the end of the servants' corridor, was sealed shut. 2 days later, when the overseer forced the door open, he found the room almost empty. The sewing table was gone, the small wooden box gone. Only a single spool of black silk remained, sitting perfectly in the center of the floor, the thread pulled taut and disappearing into a crack in the boards. When they lifted the plank, they found something strange, a folded parchment wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were pages of handwriting, elegant, deliberate, each line a confession. It was Marielle's journal. The entries began years before, long before Elise arrived, even before Henri inherited the estate. She wrote of her mother, a free Creole woman from New Orleans, and of her father, a French merchant who had promised freedom but delivered her into servitude after her mother's death. "Every stitch I make," she had written, "is a prayer for the day my hands will no longer tremble." As the years passed, the tone shifted. The journal described her work, the dresses she made for her master's lovers, his guests, and finally his fiancée. She wrote about the other women, the ones who came before Elise, and how each had disappeared after wearing one of her creations. "He told me their hearts were too weak," one entry said, "but I saw the bruises, I smelled the smoke." Then came a passage marked with a small stain of blood. "He made me weave her hair into the lining, said it would remind me who owned me. But I learned the old prayers, the ones my mother whispered when the fever took her. I sewed them into the thread. I gave them breath." The final entry was dated the night before the wedding. It read simply, "Tomorrow I finish what was begun beneath her grave. The silk remembers her, and it will remember me." Historians later speculated that Marielle had drawn from a syncretic blend of Catholic ritual and Afro-Creole folk magic, a fusion of belief systems brought from Haiti, West Africa, and Louisiana bayous. Threads, in her culture, could carry intention, silk could bind spirit to matter, but there was more. Beneath the journal, tucked into the crack of the floorboard, lay a small square of cloth, a remnant of the same silk used for Elise's gown. Under candlelight, faint words shimmered in the weave, visible only from a certain angle. "One day, the hand that punished will tremble." Years later, when descendants of the estate's owners sold the property, a historian named Dr. Celeste Duval came across the journal in a private collection. She spent months cross-referencing names and dates, uncovering that at least 3 women connected to Henri's family had died in similar accidents. One drowned in a river, one burned in her sleep, and one found lifeless with her wedding dress, blackened from within. Each had owned a dress sewn by the same lineage of seamstresses. The discovery raised chilling questions. Had Marielle's curse lingered in the silk, passed from fabric to fabric, generation to generation? Or had the women themselves carried the echo of her vengeance through bloodline and guilt? Dr. Duval published her findings in a small historical journal, but the article vanished from circulation within weeks. The archives reported water damage. The dresses in question were never recovered. Still, local legends persisted. Visitors to the old plantation claimed they heard the rhythmic sound of a sewing machine late at night. though no machine remained there. Others said they saw candlelight flickering in the attic where the spool had been found, and heard a woman humming through the walls. And on particularly stormy nights, when thunder rolled over the magnolia trees, some swore the wind itself carried words, soft, steady, threaded through the rain. Every stitch remembers, every promise bleeds. In 1923, 30 years after the cursed wedding, the plantation was nearly forgotten. Ivy had swallowed its gates, and the magnolia trees grew so thick that the house seemed buried in its own past. But history, as always, refused to stay buried. A restoration team arrived, led by Dr. Celeste Duval, the same historian who had once unearthed Marielle's journal. She had been denied access for years, but when the estate finally went up for sale, she seized the opportunity. With her came an archivist, a photographer, and a carpenter named Jonas, a quiet man with Creole roots and eyes that seemed to recognize the land before him. From the moment they entered, the air felt heavy. The walls exhaled dust, and the wooden floors groaned like they remembered every footstep. In the parlor, they found portraits blackened by mildew. Henry's eyes faded, Elise's smile cracked and peeling. The date beneath read 1893. Dr. Duval's mission was simple, to document, restore, and preserve. But as she explored the attic, the same attic that had belonged to Marielle, something changed. The moment she crossed the threshold, her lantern flickered. The air grew colder. The faint scent of magnolia drifted through the room. In the far corner, beneath a thick layer of cobwebs, she found the sewing table. Its drawers were sealed with rust, but when Jonas pried one open, a faint glitter caught the light, a needle blackened with age, and next to it a folded piece of parchment. Dr. Duval unfolded it carefully. Inside was a drawing, a dress design nearly identical to the wedding gown worn by Elise, but this one had markings along the seams, strange symbols that neither she nor Jonas recognized. They were rhythmic, circular, like prayers or incantations stitched into the blueprint itself. At the bottom of the page was a signature, Marielle Laurent, and below it a second line, added later in different handwriting, to be finished only by the one who remembers. Jonas stepped back, shaking his head. "That's old Creole script," he murmured. "Those symbols, they're not just decoration, they're bindings." Dr. Duval felt her pulse quicken. Bindings of what? He hesitated. Spirit, memory, pain. The next morning, when the team began cataloguing the attic, the photographer reported something strange. In every image taken near the sewing table, a faint silhouette appeared. A woman, head bowed, hands poised as if stitching. No one had been standing there. By the third day, the unease grew unbearable. Jonas refused to enter the attic after sunset, claiming he'd heard someone humming in the dark, a soft Creole lullaby. But Dr. Duval pressed on. She couldn't stop. Something in the story was pulling her deeper. Late one night, while reviewing the journal and the sketches side by side, she noticed a pattern, a hidden cipher woven into Marielle's words. Every fifth letter of certain entries spelled out a name. Elise Duval. Her breath caught. Duval. The same surname as her own. She turned the pages frantically, searching for more. The cipher appeared again, but this time it formed a sentence. Blood remembers what history forgets. Dr. Duval dropped the book. Her mind raced through generations of family stories. The Creole lineage her grandmother had never spoken of, the silver locket she'd inherited that bore the initials M.L. It couldn't be coincidence. Marielle hadn't cursed strangers. She had cursed her own bloodline. In that moment, the lantern beside her flickered again, and a whisper filled the air, soft, rhythmic, impossibly near. "You came back, ma fille." The voice was calm, neither cruel nor kind, simply tired. Dr. Duval turned, but the room was empty. The shadows seemed to ripple, as though something was breathing just beyond the veil of sight. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lantern toward the old mirror propped against the wall. At first, she saw only her reflection, pale, wide-eyed, exhausted. But slowly another image surfaced behind her, a woman in a simple linen dress, her skin luminous as candlelight, her fingers tracing invisible threads through the air. "Why?" Dr. Duval whispered. Marielle's reflection smiled faintly. "Because they made us forget, and I remembered." The mirror cracked. The sound rang through the attic like a shot. Jonas rushed upstairs, calling her name. When he found her, she was standing still, staring at the broken glass. In her hand was the blackened needle, but the parchment, the sketch, and the journal were gone. Days later, when authorities inspected the house after an unexplained fire gutted the attic, they found no trace of Dr. Duval. Only the sewing table remained, untouched by flame. On it lay a single unfinished dress, its fabric shimmering faintly even in the ash. Witnesses claimed that when the wind passed through the ruins, it carried the faint scent of magnolia and the soft hum of a woman's lullaby. Months after, a museum received an anonymous delivery. A charred box containing a spool of black silk and a single note. Written in delicate cursive were the words, "The curse was never vengeance, it was memory, and memory cannot burn." Historians dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, yet those who handled the silk reported the same thing. The faint rhythmic pulse beneath their fingertips, like a heartbeat stitched into the thread itself. And somewhere, beneath the magnolia trees of Louisiana, when thunder rolls and rain lashes the earth, locals still say they see the faint glow of a lantern in the attic window, and hear the soft whisper of a woman who will never stop sewing. The fire consumed more than the old plantation walls. It devoured the distance between history and the present. For those who stood before the ashes, it was impossible not to feel that something ancient had been released, something that had waited too long to be heard. The story of Marielle was no longer a ghost tale whispered in the dark. It had become a mirror, forcing everyone who dared to look into it to confront what the past truly meant. Because it wasn't just about one woman sewing revenge into a dress. It was about a world that silenced her and the many who came before and after her, until her only weapon left was the needle in her hand. Every stitch she made was an act of defiance disguised as servitude, a rebellion too subtle for history to record, but too powerful for time to erase. And that is the haunting truth of her story. Vengeance was only the shadow, memory was the fire. For centuries, the hands of women like Marielle built the very fabric of elegance that others wore with pride, yet those hands bled unseen. They stitched their grief into seams, their hope into hems, their pain into patterns. And when no one listened, they made sure the fabric itself would. Standing in the ruins of the plantation, one could almost hear their voices, layered through generations, whispering in every gust of wind. We were here. We remember. Dr. Duval's disappearance, mysterious as it was, became part of that legacy. Her name, once a footnote in the archives, began to resurface in quiet academic circles. Some argued she had uncovered a spiritual truth too complex for rational explanation. Others believed she had simply gone mad, chasing a myth, but those who read her last papers, the ones recovered from the ashes, noticed something extraordinary. In her notes, she wrote, "What we call curses are often memories that refuse to be forgotten. They live in names, in gestures, in bloodlines. History is not made of dates, it's made of wounds that keep trying to heal." It was as if Marielle had spoken through her descendant one last time, completing the seam that history had left open. The plantation never reopened. The land was reclaimed by the magnolias, their roots breaking through the old foundations like nature itself was undoing what men had built upon cruelty. Yet on quiet nights, Travelers claimed the air still shimmered with the faint glow of thread, thin, invisible strands connecting the living and the dead, binding memory to matter. And maybe that's the real curse, or the real mercy, that no story, no matter how deeply buried, stays silent forever. Marielle's story reminds us that history breathes through those who dare to listen. It teaches us that injustice, when ignored, becomes a haunting, not of places, but of conscience. And perhaps that is why her thread never broke, because it was never made of silk alone, but of something stronger, the will to be remembered. Even now, when the wind moves through the magnolia trees, it carries a rhythm, soft, measured, like the steady pull of a needle through cloth. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear the promise whispered through the years: every stitch remembers. If you've made it this far, then you've felt it, that quiet pull between the threads of history and the present. The story of Marielle isn't just a haunting tale from the 19th century. It's a reminder of how memory, injustice, and resilience are woven into every generation that follows. And now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe that objects, like that wedding dress, can carry the weight of emotion, pain, or even spirit? Or was everything that happened in that house the result of guilt and buried truth finally surfacing? Type your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, was this story about vengeance or remembrance? If you think stories like this deserve to be told, the ones that history tried to erase, the ones that give voice to those who were never allowed to speak, then you're in the right place. Because here, we uncover the forgotten corners of the past, one shadow at a time. And remember that bonus I promised at the start. Those who comment below will find a hidden clue in the next episode, a detail that connects this haunting to another story, one even darker, buried deep in the archives of the South. So, if you haven't already, subscribe now and turn on the bell. Because every week, we bring to light the forgotten stories of those who dared to resist, to remember, and to haunt history itself. Join this growing community of seekers, historians, and storytellers who believe that truth doesn't rot with time. It waits. And if you stayed until now, you already know this isn't just a story, it's a thread. And by subscribing, you're helping to pull it, stitch by stitch, until the next secret unravels. So tell me below, would you dare to wear the dress? And so, beneath the weight of rain and magnolia petals, the story of Marielle Laurent fades, not into silence but into something deeper. Her name, once whispered in fear, now lingers like a prayer. She was a seamstress, a servant, a woman the world tried to erase. Yet through a single dress, she rewrote the memory of everyone who touched it. Maybe that's what true vengeance looks like. Not fury, not fire, but remembrance that refuses to die. Because the past doesn't vanish, it waits. It waits in attics sealed by dust, in pages no one dares open, in the thread of a dress hanging where no light reaches. It waits for the moment when someone, perhaps like you, is curious enough to look closer. If you listen carefully, you can still hear her, the sound of a needle-piercing cloth, the hum of a lullaby carried through the wind, the promise that every injustice leaves a trace, and every story, no matter how buried, demands to be told. Marielle's tale is only one among many, and in the next episode, we travel from the plantations of Louisiana to the mist-covered streets of Charleston, where another secret lies hidden inside a funeral photograph that was never meant to exist. A picture taken in 1871, where one of the mourners seems to be smiling. What did she know, and what does her gaze hide from the living? If you felt the pull of Marielle's story, if something in her defiance, her sorrow, or her silence stayed with you, then stay close. Because these stories are not just about ghosts, they're about the people who refuse to disappear. So as this chapter closes, take a deep breath and remember, every shadow has a name, and every name carries a history waiting to be heard. Thank you for listening, for remembering, and for daring to step into the dark with me. And until next time, keep your lanterns close, because somewhere out there, another story is beginning to stir.